Okay, so I'm Celia Dean Drummond. I'm the director of the Laudato Si Research Institute, and I'm just here to welcome you for the final lecture of this afternoon on the second day of our conference on women, solidarity and ecology. I'm going to hand over to Dr. Mark Hirons, who's the Research Fellow in Environmental Social Science and Director of the MSc MPhil in Environmental Change and Management at the Environmental Change Institute at the University of Oxford. So thank you so much, Mark, for chairing this session, and you will do the usual reminder about Q&A, etc. So thank you so much.
Excellent, thank you very much, Celia. And yeah, it's my absolute pleasure to chair this session and to welcome you for today's keynote lecture. Professor Bebbington's giving the lecture this afternoon or today. I'm not sure where everyone is in the world. Professor Bebbington's the International Director of Natural Resources and Climate Change at the Ford Foundation and the Milton P. and Alice C. Higgins Professor of Environment and Society at the Graduate School of Geography at Clark University. He holds several other positions and has published and worked extensively on issues of political ecology, particularly in South and Central America, focusing on social and environmental relations and the extractive industries. Today his lecture's on destruction and the complex politics of urgency, responding to contemporary extractivism in the shadow of COVID. He'll be talking for about 25 or 30 minutes, and then we'll have a response from Séverine Deneulin for a short while, and then there'll be an opportunity to ask questions, and I'll be fielding those. So please do, as Celia mentioned, pose your questions on the Q&A using the Q&A button, and I'll pass those on. But without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Professor Bebbington.
Well, thank you, Mark, and thank you to those at the Laudato Si Research Institute for the kind invitation to speak today. I should say that this is a novel environment for me, and so I hope that what I have to say might be useful and relevant to some of this community's broader discussions about integral ecology, care for the environment, and living ethically with climate change. And as it turns out, there'll also be quite a lot of overlap with earlier presentations today and yesterday. My way into these issues is to begin with a reflection on how we at the Ford Foundation, especially in the Programme on Natural Resources and Climate Change, have sought to respond to COVID-19. My hope is that rather than being parochial, this can ground a reflection on some of the issues that surround the relationships between resource extraction, living well in the world, the narrative position laid out in Laudato Si, and the extent to which COVID-19 presents an urgent new scenario or an intensification of more of the same. Those themes will occupy the remaining parts of the paper after my opening vignette. The paper is grounded in 4 conversations, one with a largely Latin American literature on ontological politics and decolonialism, a second with feminist political ecology writing on the role and persecution of women environmental defenders, but role and persecution, recognizing agency, a third with theories of social movements and political settlements, and a fourth with Laudato Si itself. That said, because of the length of the talk, those conversations will remain largely implicit in what I'll have to say. So the vignette. During 2020, as COVID-19 intensified, Ford Foundation partners had experienced a dramatic increase in pressure to respond to the immediate food security, general security, and health needs of the communities where they worked. In response, most of them had reprogrammed existing resources to provide emergency forms of support to populations largely abandoned by their states. Quickly, many organizations found themselves with an overall lack of funds and unable to continue with their normal programmatic work. In response, the Ford Foundation announced towards the end of last year that it would issue bonds secured against its assets to raise $1 billion in cash to be used to address the impacts of the pandemic on civil society organizations, or CSOs. And in the spirit of urgent response, the Foundation required that this $1 billion be granted by the end of 2021. Of the $1 billion, $300 million dollars were directed at international programs, which in our case, more than doubled our rate of grant making without any increase in staff at all. The need to disperse such a lot of money quickly and without additional grant makers or grant processors meant that new grants necessarily had to be relatively few in number and large. Otherwise, it would be impossible to process them all without running Ford staff ragged into the ground. Ford's three main international programs navigated these complex challenges of urgency in slightly different ways. The Gender, Racial and Ethnic Justice Program, whose priority strategic objective is to support Black feminist leadership and above all to reduce gender-based violence, a scourge that itself was increasing under COVID, gave a small number of large grants to help create new independent funds that would provide re-granting support to these same Black feminist organizations and organizations working on GBV. The Civic Engagement and Government International Program, CEG, took a different tack. Even prior to COVID, in a context of increasing authoritarianism, CEGI had identified closing civic space as its priority issue. Under COVID-19, this civic space has become even more curtailed through everything from violence against rights defenders, as we heard earlier on, and restrictions on journalists, through to an intensification of everyday repression and monitoring of CSOs who are critical of government. These CSOs, with constraints on their capacity to do good bookkeeping, or to follow and comply with complex laws, all too easily fall foul of government audits and can be fined, closed, or simply made to disappear. So CEG's COVID response has been to fund large-scale initiatives helping CSOs deal with this systematic and everyday intimidation and their general capacity constraints. The Natural Resources and Climate Change Program, my program, faced additional problems. Our grantees were suffering the same restrictions on civic space noted above, but with additional urgencies. Infections and mortalities have been severe in both Indigenous and Afro-descendant communities, including many deaths of organizational leaders. Third parties were using the cover of COVID, such as restrictions on mobility and the absence of public and other monitoring institutions, to invade communities' lands and intimidate and kill those who resisted, including women leaders resisting, among others, mining and resource extraction. And indeed, some of the cases in the video that was shown just before the break are instances of this sort of intimidation. So these processes and the accompanying impunity were not new, but they did get worse with COVID restrictions. At the same time, lockdowns meant a reduction of accountability, with government officers being told to only do, and this is a quotation from sources, light touch enforcement of rules and environmental sanctions, and often travel to rural areas was forbidden. And of course, some governments have just been blatant in intimidating social movement leaders. A recent case is the Brazilian police force's questioning of Sonia Wahara, leader of PIBE, the Association of Indigenous Peoples in Brazil, on the grounds that she had slandered President Bolsonaro on her podcast documenting the effects of COVID and the responsible parties for those effects in indigenous communities in Brazil. And of course, alongside these high-profile cases has been the everyday intimidation of thousands of environmental and human rights defenders, acts of intimidation that do not make the news. In summary, frontline communities, those who ultimately defend forests and other natural resources from industrial scale extraction and other forms of despoliation, were and are under stress. We did a rapid survey of our partner grantees, and that identified the following principal worries, repeating some of the earlier points. They referred to shrinking civic space, problems of financial resilience as overall resources declined and they had to use programmatic resources for emergency use, mental health and wellness. The sheer pressure and stress of operating under these circumstances exerts an acute psychological effect on people working inside these organizations. The challenge of not getting torn between urgency and strategy. The challenges of connectivity, not just the physical need to be connected to communicate under COVID, but a whole raft of problems of digital security to protect those communications from oversight by actors that would do harm otherwise to these organizations. And then that came together with new pressures on forests, lands, and territories, and deepening inequalities and insecurities. Underlying these last two of the stresses that they noted is the well-founded fear that natural resource extraction will be prominent in any strategies of economic reactivation that governments propose in order to deal with the macroeconomic consequences of COVID. This is already happening. Just as one example, the so-called Omnibus Bill in Indonesia, which was passed last year, with barely any civil society consultation, partly on the grounds that COVID made such consultation hazardous, is a law that's reduced environmental and social safeguards. It's done a whole raft of other things too, but it's reduced these safeguards on investment, including investment in natural resource extraction, mining, hydrocarbons, and infrastructure. And even to the surprise of some of the lawmakers, has effectively granted impunity to certain environmental criminals who've cleared forests. And as it turns out, the law allows them to delay any responsibility for that. A recent multi-country study by the Forest Peoples Programme there in England, based in the UK, concludes that those sorts of trends are also clear across Brazil, Colombia, Peru, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, as well as Indonesia. So in this context, the challenge to the Natural Resources and Climate Change Programme has been to find responses that respond to the immediate crises faced by communities and organizations, that also anticipate the future to avert the worst scenarios of what might come, and third, that at the same time support CSO capacity to address the structures of power that drive the inequalities that underlie all this in the first place. These different challenges are, I think, also relevant for a critical reading of Laudato Si, and I will return to that later. But first I want to jump to this more institutional, operational discussion of efforts at philanthropic solidarity and practice, to a reflection on issues at stake in the post-COVID policies of economic reactivation that the CSOs that we work with expressed such concern about. So what is at stake? Destruction has permeated the modern project. This has taken multiple faces. The destruction of Aboriginal societies in the face of white demographic expansion and expanded capital investment. The multiple destructions visited by the Atlantic slave trade. The destruction of land cover and biota due to human land use. The granted initially unwitting, later quite conscious destruction of atmospheric flows and equilibria by carbon-based industrial energy that we've heard about earlier on today, coupled with the much more witting and conscious destruction of urban atmospheric qualities in the cities of industry, one of which I grew up in. I'm a proud boy of Stoke-on-Trent, that at a certain point in history was deemed to have the dirtiest air in Europe as a consequence of industry in the city. And that pollution was quite clearly a conscious act on the part of industrial owners. There's a close relationship between extractivism and this destruction. While there are different and disputed definitions of extractivism, one of its core features is a human taking of rents from the biosphere and the lithosphere, surpluses that are produced neither by human action nor human ingenuity. Taking hydrocarbons from the underground is to extract such a rent. In some senses, using the atmosphere as an unpaid for sink for the pollutants produced by burning these hydrocarbons is to extract another rent. Using the hydrosphere as an unpaid for sink for pollutants from mining, another rent. Logging, mining, the control of land, and the extraction of unpaid for value from human bodies, all rents. The very act of extracting these rents destroys both life and inert matter, with frequent collateral destruction as well. The destruction of systems of governance, of social relationships, landscapes of meaning, histories remembered through the landscape, and other worlds. Peruvian anthropologist, colleague and friend Marisol La Cadena discussed how open pit mining of the mountain Osungati in Peru would have destroyed not just the mountain landscape, but also other worlds, the worlds of earth beings, perceptible to her indigenous Quechua informants, and at the very least imaginable to Marisol herself. Mario Blaser, Arturo Escobar, and other anthropologists exploring ontological politics have each developed a similar argument, that modernity in general, and extraction in particular, have been complicit in the destruction of worlds, and the crunching of a pluriverse of worlds, plural, into a universe of one world. There is a very real risk that one policy response to the destruction of lives and of value that has been wrought by COVID will be to facilitate and encourage yet further destruction. A politics of urgency, the urgency of restoring growth, the urgent need to rebuild a base for public finance, the urgent need for employment, and so on, will both encourage and provide political cover for making those policy decisions quickly. Just as happened after structural adjustment, we might expect efforts to prioritize investment in natural resource extraction after COVID, precisely because resource extraction is made more profitable through the subsidies of nature. And to the extent that extraction is also destruction, these will be policies encouraging destruction as a means to respond to destruction in the effort to go back to the pre-COVID project. There is a second, less intuitive perhaps, phase to this possible deepening of destruction, and that's the acceleration of the energy transition, about which we've also talked this morning. Climate change is urgent, and while there is no choice but for there to be an energy transition, this transition brings significant risks of further damage. And this is manifest at different scales and across diverse geographies, and here just to note a few. My own colleague here at Clark University in Massachusetts, John Rogan, is documenting the steady, slow, but steady loss of forest cover in Massachusetts due to the progressive installation of small fields of solar panels. In Mexico, various scholars and activists have documented how wind farms have already been installed on community lands, in the process displacing traditional decision-making processes and extracting the rent of land and of free wind, and having the collateral destruction of vistas and of prior forms of land governance accompanying those wind farms. At a global scale, colleagues at the University of Queensland estimate that the energy transition will mean that during just the first half of the 21st century, we will see 9 times more copper mine tailings being produced than was the case during the 20th century. 9 times more tailings produced, and that's just copper. In the same vein, the expanded extraction, this has been mentioned earlier on today in a question, the expanded extraction of lithium in the Andes of Chile, Argentina, and Bolivia that's required for lithium batteries will lead to the irreversible destruction of the salt flats in whose brine the lithium resides. And some 70% of global cobalt is currently sourced from the forests of the DRC, and its expanded extraction will inevitably lead to forest damage and forest loss. Now, it might be argued that this destruction associated with transition will allow for recovery elsewhere, as the scarred landscapes of open cast coal mining in Kalimantan and Sumatra, or the polluted waters surrounding oil wells in the Amazon are allowed to recuperate. But this argument makes a double assumption. First, the assumption that landscape restoration investments that are needed to help speed those processes will indeed be forthcoming. And second, that recuperation is even possible. The Amazonian savannization argument, the fear that once a certain level of deforestation occurs within the Amazon, lands will be permanently savannas, suggests that recuperation is not always possible. And of course, the multiple ontologies of other earth beings or indigenous people who had lived in isolation are also gone forever, never to recover. It might also be argued that destruction is simply the other face of the coinage of development, and that this destruction will bring jobs and revenues for social investment. But there's a caveat here also. This was the argument made in Peru, a country close to my heart, to legitimate the extractive boom that ran with its ups and downs from the early 90s through to 2020. And yet, notwithstanding 2.5 decades of mining ostensibly paying taxes and royalties for public investment, once COVID took root in Peru, the country's health system quickly collapsed. The acute inequality of access to healthcare, and thus also of the propensity to die, became starkly apparent. And a large percentage of the population had no access to government social transfers because even after 25 years of this mining-led modernization, they were still working in the informal economy. These experiences made clear that there is no obvious route from extraction to social and economic inclusion, and that the nature of Peru's political settlement had made this so. Peru's performance under COVID should be a cautionary note to arguments for a post-COVID recovery grounded in the promotion of natural resource extraction. It didn't work that way last time. I make these comments to suggest that extraction and destruction have resided in the beating heart of modernity. Capitalism has been enormously subsidized by destruction from natural resource extraction and the associated conversion of the commons into privately appropriated wealth. And the risk is that the urgency of the post-COVID moment elicits a deepening of this extraction and thus of these diverse forms of damage and destruction. Now, in many regards, Laudato Si places the sorts of communities I've been referring to that are cohabiting with extraction at the center of its argument and expresses concern about this destruction. For instance, it says, this is quoting a couple of paragraphs from the encyclical, many intensive forms of environmental exploitation and degradation not only exhaust the resources which provide local communities with their livelihood, but also undo the social structures which for a long time shaped cultural identity and their sense of the meaning of life and community. And it goes on, in this sense, it is essential to show special care for indigenous communities and their cultural traditions. When they remain on their land, they themselves care for it best. Nevertheless, this is still quoting, in various parts of the world, pressure is being put on them to abandon their homelands to make room for agricultural or mining projects which are undertaken without regard for the degradation of nature and culture. Now, the idea that when communities, quote, remain on their land, they themselves care for it best, unquote, is also a central tenet of our natural resources and climate change program. And a lot of our grantees are indeed Indigenous and Afro-descendant organizations. However, it's also the case that communities negotiate the threat of destruction of their lands and ecologies in diverse ways. Sometimes the conflict that surrounds extractive industry investment is indeed driven by a wholehearted resistance and desire to protect territory and ecology. A resistance, as we saw earlier on, often led by women, or in which women play critical roles, as diverse examples. The one I'd noted in my notes here was Standing Rock, but there are plenty of examples of this. However, conflict and mobilization can be driven by other aspirations too. These can include efforts to capture compensation from extractive industry companies, or to arrive at agreements that give communities a greater share in the financial benefits that flow from extraction. And there are plenty of examples of community-based consultative processes that, however imperfect, suggest that community members have been interested in renegotiating project design and benefit distribution rather than blocking investment in resource extraction wholesale. The implication is that communities are sometimes predisposed to negotiate destruction and to trade in care of the land for other forms of benefit. Now, it may be argued that this predisposition is a consequence of their poverty, and that under different distributional conditions, their motivations and actions might be different. However, these are the distributional structures from which they have to negotiate, and from which they will have to negotiate as new waves of extractive investment arrive, driven, among other things, by post-COVID reactivation policies and the mineral and land-based demands of the energy transition. And governments will similarly be negotiating these forces from positions of fiscal poverty. So just as destruction and an acceptance of destruction is coded into modernity, an acceptance of extractive destruction is also part of how communities have negotiated and lived with this modernity. This challenges philanthropy, and perhaps also theology, though that's not for me to say, to have a view on what destruction is acceptable, under what conditions, where, and when. And perhaps especially in the current scenario, what is acceptable under conditions of urgency. Care for our common home, then, may also involve destroying some of it. Now, this is not the same as saying that humans have the God-bestowed right to dominate nature, not only because this position has helped drive the current ecological crisis, but also because the power to dominate is always unequally distributed. Nonetheless, I suggest, we need to determine our guardrails for approaching degrees of destruction, and we need them as much as we may need to hear exhortations regarding the imperative of care. In a commentary on the Instrumentum Laboris for the Amazon Synod, Séverine, my discussant, reflected on the conditions that might need to be in place for extractivism to be regulated in ways that align with climate change and the right to live well. She suggested that one, and I'm quoting, one kind of meta driver of policy change might be the emergence of coherent alternative narratives about development through communication in the public sphere and the building of coalition and mass mobilization. And she went on to suggest Laudato Si and the Synod on the Amazon might be the first steps in that direction. The point is an important one. Social movements theory draws attention to how movements play an important role in shifting narratives by reframing questions and placing new ideas in the public sphere. Theories of institutional change and political settlements similarly argue that ideas and narratives are central to explaining how institutions change under given relations of power. Ideas can have the effect of changing social definitions of what and who is legitimate, can help recruit new actors to particular causes, and can change notions of what is desirable and possible, itself a source of motivating and mobilizing power. And the remarkable Greta Thunberg and all that she has triggered is, it seems to me, an embodiment of those very points. I'd suggest that these are theories within which to read Laudato Si. It lays out a series of ideas and claims that might sustain a coherent narrative hinging around the value of all life. It makes a case for the centrality of care as an ethical response to this value of all life and to the idea of Earth as an inherited home rather than an investable resource. At the same time, though, Laudato Si elides difficult questions. It evades any real guidance on trade-offs and the criteria on which they should be made. When it mentions the industries of resource extraction, it is generally critical of them, without exploring the conditions under which mining, for instance, should still proceed. And that's a particular problem given its calls for climate change mitigation also, which demand the clean energy transition, which in turn needs the products of metal mining on a large scale. And there's also the challenge of resolving the relationships that Laudato Si might accept between destruction, the financing of social policy, and dignified employment. I think that these are real questions to confront, not ones to be written off as being posed by those who, to quote Laudato Si, now quoting, those who, with the excuse of realism and pragmatism, tend to ridicule expressions of concern for the environment. That's not the point here. Laudato Si also invokes the power of reason and persuasion, eliding discussions of the power of raw power. This restricted attention to power is also a limitation when confronting extractive industries, where politics are often characterized by the exercise of this same raw power. The way in which raw power truncates any act of reasoning is manifested most blatantly by the killings of environmental defenders, documented in the Global Witness reports noted earlier, and the use of gender-based violence to intimidate communities in resistance. This power is also manifest in the sustained lobbying by certain interests to weaken environmental and social regulations in the name of removing barriers to investment, and so on. Some of what has gone on during COVID makes evident that denunciation on moral grounds has not done much to change such behavior and exercise of power. As the post-COVID context places more pressure on the natural resources that serve as the basis for many communities' territories, livelihoods, lives, and senses of meaning, many practical questions remain. And these are questions for our own natural resources and climate change program. How might community organizations and their allies be able to reduce such violence through strategies of territorial control, community-based self-policing of territory, and interconnected networks of protection? One of the key CEG questions. What sorts of investment needs to be made to improve digital access and digital security in order to call out violence in real time? How can litigation be used to defend rights, protect environmental regulations, and sue those who infringe them and infringe other norms? And how can constituencies be widened in ways that moderate some of the raw power of extractive industry lobbies that give them preferential access to decision-making? And so on. While it's obviously not the job of Laudato Si to answer such questions, it may be the case, to follow Séverine's suggestion, that the document can contribute to a narrative that helps articulate actors into movements, and on the back of the force of such movements, contributes to change in how resource extraction is governed. Such changes might create more space for some of these other changes to take root, and I suppose might be part of a broader form of the ecological conversion that's invoked in Laudato Si. Indeed, the encyclical itself says, social problems must be addressed by community networks and not simply by the sum of individual good deeds. The ecological conversion, it carries on, needed to bring about lasting change is also a community conversion. But again, there are several howevers here. The first is that this narrative, if it's to be honest, must grapple with destruction as much as it does with care. It would have to accept the legitimacy, perhaps even the moral rightness, of some degree of destruction, as much as it seeks to articulate actors around the idea of care. And the second, however, takes us back to questions posed in the abstract in the program for this paper. Is it adequate to wait for policy change to emerge from social mobilization or new narratives promoted by documents such as Laudato Si? Is it adequate to wait? And here we return to the complex politics of urgency. Short of a society-wide version of Saul's experience on the road to Damascus, this conjoint ecological and community conversion will take time, and time is what the biosphere does not have. So a societal ecological conversion, which I think has been at the forefront of, essentially at the forefront of the calls in each of the presentations today, a societal ecological conversion will have to be manufactured quickly. And it'll have to be manufactured quickly in the face of asymmetries of power, closing civic space, and the gathering forces supporting a further round of post-COVID destruction. And it seems to me that's the challenge that lies before us in this meeting and before those points of convergence and connection between documents and encyclicals such as Laudato Si and documents such as our own natural resources and climate change strategy. And once again, I'm very grateful to the organizers for inviting me to this event. It's been truly a pleasure and a real eye-opener and a real learning moment for me. So thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Tony. That's fantastic. So many threads and challenges to pick up on. Before we open up for wider questions, I'm going to turn it over to Séverine Deneulin, who's the part-time director of international development at the Laudato Si Research Institute and also an associate professor at the University of Bath. She's also worked extensively in Latin America, particularly on how religious and secular approaches to development can kind of enhance development policy and practice. And so I'll hand over to her for the first response. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Mark, and thank you very much, Tony, for this very thought-provoking presentation. So I'd like to frame my response from the perspective of the Catholic social tradition rather than development studies, given that the purpose of this conference is to bring these different disciplines into dialogue. And I would like to focus on 3 points that you raise, which I hope can generate a potential fruitful dialogue between theology, the social sciences, and the reality of climate change and natural resource extraction. The first one is on your analysis of destruction, which I will contrast with the dynamics of the crucifixion and resurrection. The second point is in relation to the dilemma between addressing the urgent versus addressing the structural. And the third point is about narratives and framing and the implication of your analysis of power and the shrinking of civil space for the work of the Catholic Church as a civil society actor. So on the first point, you argued that natural resource extraction inherently brings destruction in its wake, and that destruction is at all levels: material, social, ontological, cultural, and so on. Unfortunately, until we massively invest in recycling metals, there is no escape from extraction. As you noted, even our so-called green transition is inherently destructive. We may no longer rely on fossil fuel, but green technologies are rare earth mineral intensive, and as we heard yesterday from Sharon in Malaysia. And this is why you conclude that if Laudato Si is to help shape a new narrative, it must grapple with destruction as much as it does with care. And as you said, no, we need to ask the question, what destruction is acceptable, under what conditions, where, and when? And this is a very complex question, as some people see this destruction as acceptable, as enabling more revenues into the government's pocket, and others see this destruction as unacceptable, for it kills their forests, livelihoods, language, memories, and so on. And the latter, as we've also talked today and heard today, are prepared to have their own lives destroyed for the sake of protecting that other life of trees, of waters, histories, and of the spirits which dwell in them. And many of those risking their lives, like Victoria, whom we heard from Christine earlier, do not see themselves as much as environmental defenders, as simply life defenders. This dynamics of death and resurrection is at the core of the Christian faith, and every celebration of the Eucharist remembers that death and destruction does not have the last word, that life is stronger and triumphs over darkness and death. Destruction may be in the genetic code of modernity and capitalism, but the dynamics of death and life is in the genetic code of creation. Should we not revert the question of what kind of destruction is acceptable to what kind of life is acceptable, for whom, and how should life be governed, and which lives are more important than others, and which lives should be sacrificed? Many activists talk of zones of sacrifice to highlight how some people in some land have to die to make the lives of others more comfortable, such as the people we heard yesterday in Malaysia around the rare earth mineral processing plant. Taking the governance of life, rather than the governance of destruction, as our analytical grid, might help connect better the lives of some to the lives of others. It might make us more aware that the governance of natural resource extraction in places where these resources are located is intimately connected to the governance of the places where these resources are used and consumed. And as we heard today about integral ecology, it's all about this interconnectedness between what's happening in England and what's happening in Peru and so on. And this leads me to my second point, the dilemma between responding to the urgent versus the strategic. The idea of ecological conversion is the beating heart of Laudato Si. But as you said, this conversion takes time, and time is something that the planet does not have. But should there always be a tension between addressing the urgent and the structural? Or can the two not be mutually supportive? That is, when addressing the urgent and responding to the immediate needs, one could also address the structural. This dialectic of love and justice has been at the core of the Catholic social tradition. Laudato Si argued that love, overflowing with small gestures of mutual care, is also civic and political. Have all the actions of love, the small gestures of mutual care that have been displayed during COVID, not affected on macro relationships at the economic, social, and political level? You argue that philanthropy cannot take its eye from the ball from investing in responses to the underlying drivers of destruction. But could we not talk of affirming the drivers of life rather than putting guards on the drivers of destruction? Could there be a role for philanthropy to open its eyes to the little new shoots of life that COVID has enabled amidst the massive destruction, so as to lead the way for structural transformation? Perhaps something can be learned here from the thousands of women in Latin America, Africa, and Asia, whose stories we heard yesterday and today, who showed great courage to protect their life in the midst of adversity. Could they be given greater roles in governing life in order to overcome destruction? But maybe these are naive questions in the context of what you have called raw power, and which Christine also talked about in relation to the personal cost of defending life. And this leads me to my third point about taking the Catholic social tradition away from its idealism. You have rightly pointed out that denunciation on moral grounds has not done much to change power relations. Pope Francis may denounce as injustice and crime the businesses which harmed the Amazon and failed to respect the right of the original peoples. He may denounce them as instruments of death, but Querida Amazonia is not going to change much the way power is exercised. Indeed, as you highlighted, Laudato Si, as does I think Querida Amazonia, evades the trade-offs between care for the earth and care for the poor. It may all be well for Pope Francis to write that the human environment and the natural environment deteriorate together, but how they may flourish together is left for others to answer. Maybe I was far too optimistic to write in October 2019 that Laudato Si would unleash a global movement that would construct a new grand narrative around the meaning of progress, incapable of transforming the basic structure of our societies. The context of raw power can seem overwhelming, as we have heard in Christine's presentation. And despite the global mobilization following the murder of Berta Cáceres in 2016 in Honduras for her activism in protecting the land of the Lenca people, well, this has not prevented another murder in the same place in December 2020 of another person, Felix Vasquez, who had continued her struggle. As you ask, is waiting for policy change to emerge from social mobilization sufficient, especially in conditions of shrinking service space? Undoubtedly, the Catholic social tradition can do much more in giving greater prominence to structures of power in its analysis, as well as showcasing much more the protagonism of women in driving life in all its forms. And this is an agenda that urgently needs to be addressed. And I don't think that we should wait for a papal encyclical that takes a gender perspective to start with work, because I think we might wait for a very long time. But what else do we have than courageous social mobilization built on love to change the dynamics of destruction into a dynamics of life for all? As we have heard from the stories at the local level from Arusha that try to make life both human and non-human better. And after all, the story of salvation within the Christian tradition started with a courageous woman. So let us hope that all the stories of women that we've heard today may be the start of this new life and this hope that we have heard about. So thank you.
Thank you, Séverine, for that very powerful response. Yeah, now we have an opportunity for you who are here to pose a question, either to Tony or Séverine. And while you're having a think and posing your questions, I will use my position as chair to kind of pose the first question. First, to say, Tony, feel free if you want to pick up any threads of Séverine's response that you want to. One of the elements which really struck me was this question really about the extent to which philanthropy can really support the little new shoots of life, I think was the phrase Séverine used to describe some of the kind of very local, small scale kind of seeds of hope really that the COVID pandemic has brought, and what in the context of kind of a large philanthropic foundation like the Ford Foundation can be done to support that, and rather than kind of work against those. But either take that as a starting point or anything else that you'd like to while we while the rest of the audience poses their own questions.
Thanks, Séverine. Thanks, Mark. And thank you for the careful reading of the paper, Séverine. And I think that question about, I mean, in some sense, at the core of the challenge is the problem of scale. So, yes, there is obviously a role, and we would hope that that's part of what we do, to identify these shoots of new life, areas of innovation, particularly creative actors, To do that, you have to have good knowledge, strong networks, and that's always something that Ford certainly, and I think all organizations can improve. I'm also involved in Oxfam, on the board of Oxfam US, similar challenge, how to learn well to identify those innovations, where I say innovation, not around notions of love necessarily, but around notions of technology, but the sort of innovations that Séverine was talking about. And this she wrote about a number of years ago with a colleague when she wrote about the importance of hope movements. So there's a lot to be done there. But there is also, it's not a but, it's not quite, that's not the right word. And there is also the challenge of scale. You know, the way, in what ways and can those innovations and mobilizations form meshworks so that their influence on particular policy debates, on particular political debates, on particular dominant narratives spreads across space and across society. And I think that's another important role for philanthropies and other actors to try to play and to try and identify and support mechanisms through which that scaling of narratives and scaling of innovations might occur. I mean, we try to do it. I think it would be a big claim to say we do it, but we try to do it in various ways that range from supporting Indigenous organizations across a whole range of scales, through to relatively local organizations, up to something called the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities, which is an alliance of Aman in Indonesia, Indigenous Confederation in Indonesia, COICA for the Amazon Basin, APIBE in Brazil, and the Mesoamerican Alliance for People and Forests in Mesoamerica. So that's an effort to try and support a structure that helps scale narratives and arguments. We also do it, and with this I'll just make one other comment after this. We'll also do it, we'll also try to do it through support to strategic communications, which is trying to facilitate ways in which those more local, hope-based, innovative narratives find their ways into, we are more US-oriented, so find their ways into New York Times, websites like Mongabay and so forth. So that's another part of our work, is trying to foster strategic communication rather than just generic communication. The other comment I want to make, and it's been kind of on my mind since writing this was, I mean, partly I don't have much time these days, so it's done quickly. And partly I think it was done quickly because it was cathartic. And this theme of the destruction that comes with everything has been on my mind for a while, particularly as we start doing more work in the foundation around energy transition. But I was struck by a question that Francis Stewart posed in the previous session because it resonated with something that's been bugging me, as to whether my going that route in my own catharsis and in this paper is itself a reflection of a certain masculinity and a certain male way of thinking about these issues, counterposed to what Séverine said about, well, shouldn't it be about the governance of life rather than worrying about distraction? I have no answer to this, but I just want to recognize that it's a thing, and it may be a thing that's present in this paper and in this argument.
Wonderful. Yeah, similar thoughts that actually crossed my mind. Yeah, lots to unpack in terms of disciplinary training and gender, dynamics of scale, these issues. We have another couple of questions. I'm going to pose one from Lisa Sel Cahill. She's asking whether either of you can say something or anything concrete about Catholic activities such as support for anti-mining activists, lawsuits, etc., and how they speak to the problems of destruction and limits. We, the big who we, may we can't establish general enforceable criteria for destruction, so at a more kind of pragmatic level, there are kind of local targeted efforts of resistance to some of these extractive industries, and kind of locally led efforts to set limits on these things. And there might be ways in which these might percolate up to regional, industry-wide international norms and agreements. And yeah, so I think there's this question, as I interpret it, is really driving this question of scale. How do kind of local level efforts, including by kind of the Catholic Church and Catholic social movements, percolate up or out to affect wider norms and agreements? Yeah, any kind of commentary on that idea would be very welcome, I think.
Well, I'll have a quick go, then pass over to Séverine, who's much more embedded in those networks. But all I would say is that my experience is primarily in Latin America, and the Catholic Church, and perhaps more precisely certain orders within the groups within the Catholic Church, have been very active in supporting mining resistance movements, and to the extent possible through the structure of the church itself, helping scale some of the arguments of those movements. And that support has come through the hierarchy of the church, priests, bishops, and so forth, as well as through the work of catechists, who, it's not that they're always present in these movements, but there is I think a statistical over-representation of them in at least the movements I've come across. So the church has played an important role in supporting these processes. And my reading is that it's largely one driven from a principle of the rights and dignity of communities to be able to live well and live as they would live. Séverine can say more about other instances. My understanding is that in certain cases, certain Catholic NGOs have had certainly adjacent relationships with litigation as well, which is another way of taking cases to scale as well. You can just go litigate something in the US or in Europe, or you can do, this is another way of taking things to scale where the church has certainly been important, trying to influence the rollout of the European Union's due diligence regulations as well. Around commodity flows and commodity imports. On the question about whether we can or can't come up with general guidelines, see, I'm not entirely sure about that. I appreciate it's hard, but it's also the case that we always choose, whoever the we are, whether it's a we giving resources, support to certain organizations, or it's a we, the Ford Foundation, choosing to work with certain partners and not other partners. And if we're choosing on the basis of criteria that are more or less explicit, but they are there. And in the choices made about where to work on issues of extraction, I think implicitly there is always a set of criteria, often more implicit than explicit, about where the guardrails are being set by that particular chooser on issues of what sort of destruction is acceptable. So I'm not entirely sure that we can escape that. I don't think it's enough to say, well, it depends on what communities want to lead on, because there are many more communities than there are relationships and networks of solidarity. So choices are always being made.
Séverine, do you want to come in?
Yeah, just to add on what Tony said about the role of the Catholic Church in resisting mining, and well, I think that in order to go beyond ecological conversion and the formation of conscience, there's always an aversion of the church to enter into politics, which can get very dirty and quickly fall into political partisanship. And yeah, the church has been very active in some places, especially when the hierarchy has been supportive. I think, for example, of the diocese of Huancayo, led by Pedro Barreto, a Jesuit, who and the town of La Oroya, which is one of the 10 most polluted towns on earth. They have received a lot of support from the local, from the Catholic Church, supporting local organizations, precisely because I think the hierarchy was supportive. And so the problem, I think, with the church involved in anti-mining protest depends also on church politics. And it is also it's a tricky situation. But I think the role of the church is, in terms of the tradition and the teaching, is about accompaniment and not about political partisanship. I think we come back to the old debates of liberation theology and taking sides. And I think that it was beautiful, the presentation of Arosha, saying that we're not taking side, we are bringing communities together and seek life for all, as opposed to be, for one against the other. And I think the church is at the very early stage in that response, in terms of, and I mean, Catholic is doing great work as well in policy advocacy. But there's always a danger, I think, of, just in order to change balance of power, we must get into politics. And that's tricky for the church that tries to be not neutral, but not taking side. But the Pope will be at the COP26 in Glasgow, so he's trying to influence the process there by bypassing politics and by choosing diplomatic routes.
Although the political ecologist in me says bypassing politics isn't not a possible thing to do, but that's a discussion for another day. There's just different forms of politics. There's lots of really fascinating comments and questions coming through on the chat. I had been asked to kind of hand back to Cecilia, but I want to just pose one very quick question and ask the Tony and Séverine to give maybe a short response before I do hand it back, which I think is a really interesting question. It comes from Catherine, and it's, how do you think we can keep up the dialogue and keep learning from each other in this in this space, I guess, between different people from disciplinary backgrounds and actors in the space and at different scales. So yeah, quick thought on that, and then I'll hand back to Cecilia to close.
I guess the first lesson, the how, that we should, and that is valuable for sure. It's definitely valuable. And I think that kind of collective societal ecological conversion, if one's going to frame it that way, necessarily requires bridging across intellectual, social, faith-based communities. Without that's not going to happen. You're not going to get that scaling, and you're not going to get that collective conversion. Which, to look at Jenny's question here, I don't think to believe in the possibility of that is not naive. It's kind of hope and faith, but it's not naive. The how is to keep on talking, and to create venues for that talk, for those conversations. But there's not time to go into details, but that is important, yes. And at the center of the how is to keep on talking and create venues for those conversations that are sort of safe venues as well.
Séverine, final few words from you, if you will.
Well, yes, the Laudato Si Research Institute will organize what we are calling listen roundtables, where we can bring these different disciplines, but also the voice of the local communities together. But I think it's also about an awareness. Many people in Europe don't know about the cost of electric cars. When you mentioned that copper will use 9 times more tailing, they will have 9 times more tailing of copper than we have now because of the drive of electric cars. I mean, I was in northern Chile 2 years ago, and I driving through these mine tailings was just mind blowing, and I think that we'll have 9 times more than that. It's just, yeah, so people are just not aware, and on preparing the response, I saw an article by a journalist who was visiting the mines of neodymium in China. Neodymium is a key component of our electronic device and semiconductors. And actually, everyone who has these earplugs that are wireless, they use neodymium, creating absolute devastation there. And now the journalist said, well, after doing this documentary, I kind of never looked at my mobile phone the same way as I did before. And I think, yeah, so creating this space of encounter, not only in terms of the disciplines, but also about the effect that our lives have on others. I think it's absolutely essential. Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. Yeah, the tension of holding these things remotely online and the resources required, and the great kind of opportunity to be together, even though we're far apart, just speaks to some of the complexities of it, doesn't it? So yeah, thank you both hugely for your contributions, and to people who've asked questions and added comments. Sorry we didn't have time to get through them all, but yeah, thank you very much. Really great session to end the day, and with that I'll hand back to Celia for some closing words, I think.
Well, just to thank you, thank both Tony and Séverine and Mark for leading a wonderful final session for us today. I think the themes that have come out for me most strongly are about both the constraint of power that's necessary, but also the fostering of power for the powerless, but also, again, the importance of dialogue. So I hope all of you who've been with us all day, or most of it, or afternoon rather, or maybe in the morning for some of you, have enjoyed this session, and we very much look forward to you coming back and joining our sessions tomorrow as well for the final segment of our conference. So with that, I thank you all very much for being part of this. We're all part of a learning community, and it's been a real pleasure to have you with us. And of course, a big thank you to all the speakers and panelists that have joined us today.